What will later be discovered in the kitchen of an apartment on Lake Lane will give this case a name that would eventually echo across the internet. It will be forever linked to a pot on the stove and what was found inside. But that discovery is still a few hours away. For now, it is the morning of October 8, 2023, a quiet Sunday in the village of Michurinskoye, Leningrad region, a peaceful spot where nothing usually happens that would require an emergency police response. At about 9:30 a.m., a call comes into the local police department. A man's voice, frantic and tense, reports that his own brother is currently doing something to a person in his apartment, something the officer on duty couldn't even immediately record in the log. This wasn't an anonymous tip or a neighbor hearing noise through the walls. This was a brother who had seen the events with his own eyes and dialed the police himself. The operator confirmed the address, Michurinskoye, Lake Lane, and a unit was dispatched immediately. Although the distance from the regional center was about 90 kilometers, the nearest officers were much closer. As the patrol car sped along the empty Sunday roads, the information was already being passed to detectives and forensic experts. The nature of the call left no room for lighter interpretations. What exactly the caller witnessed, how he got there, why he arrived that particular morning, and what had happened the night before. The answers to these questions would later prove to be even heavier than the call itself. The unit reached Lake Lane quickly. The apartment door was unlocked, and the brother was waiting outside. The first thing the officers noticed upon entering was the smell, heavy, thick, and unmistakable. They followed it into the kitchen. On the floor lay what forensic experts would later spend pages describing in their reports. The evidence of what had occurred was obvious, with no attempt to conceal the scene. Parts of what wasn't immediately visible were later found in the freezer. Other remains were in a basin nearby, and a limb was discovered on the ground outside, beneath the window. But the most significant discovery was on the stove, a large pot. Along with potatoes, it contained what had once been a human being. It's important to understand, this did not look like an attempt to destroy evidence. Not acid, not fire. It looked like meal preparation. A regular pot on a regular stove with peeled and sliced potatoes. Someone clearly intended to consume this, or perhaps already had. The owner of the apartment, a 53-year-old man, was present. Unemployed, he didn't try to flee or resist. He was detained and taken to the station. During interrogation, he exercised his right to remain silent. Not a word, not an explanation. At this stage, investigators had a question they couldn't yet answer. It wasn't who, that was clear. The question was why. Why the pot, why the potatoes, and why put it on the heat? When investigators checked the suspect's background, they expected to find a criminal record or past conflicts with the law. But the database was empty. A completely clean biography. The man's name was Dmitry. He turned out to be quite well known in the region, a candidate for Master of Sports in alpine skiing, a professional athlete and an instructor at a ski resort. He had been skiing since the mid-70s, practically since early childhood. He also enjoyed football, volleyball, and fishing. He had spent his entire life active, outdoors, and among people. Colleagues later interviewed by journalists couldn't reconcile the two images. One described him as kind, sympathetic, calm, and thoughtful. Others confirmed that Dmitry was always steady in the workplace. His students included high-ranking individuals. And yet, this same man, the athlete, the instructor, the one described as calm and thoughtful, was now sitting in a cell, while back in his apartment was that kitchen with the pot on the stove. Between the instructor's resume and what was found on Lake Lane, there was clearly a story, something that had turned a professional athlete into an unemployed man living alone in a village. But at that moment, no one knew the details except his brother, who was currently giving his testimony. The neighbors in Michurinskoye weren't surprised by the police presence. They were surprised by the reason. They knew Dmitry, but no longer as an athlete. To them, he was a man who hadn't worked in a long time. Every day he walked to the local shops asking for change for drinks, cigarettes, or sometimes food. He drank constantly, as if it had become his daily routine. Morning, shop, bottle, over and over. Yet there was no aggression, no scandals. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, and never rowdy. He would ask, but never demand. If refused, he'd walk away quietly. He lived alone and bothered no one. He had never been on the police radar. No complaints, no reports. To the local officer, Dmitry was essentially invisible. Formally, everything was fine. A man living a quiet life. He hadn't just stopped working. He had stopped being who he was, and he did it so quietly that no one noticed. Neighbors only saw the result. A quiet man who drank every day and interacted with no one. And then, the discovery in his apartment. Before dealing with Dmitry, the investigation had to identify the individual found in his kitchen. They were identified quickly. Mikhail, 43 years old, a local man with a disability. He couldn't work for health reasons and lived on a small pension that barely covered food and drinks. The village knew him too, not as a specialist, but as a local fixture, a lonely man without a family, often seen near the shops. But there was one trait everyone remembered: his tongue, sharp, fast, and unfiltered. A friend later told journalists that he was always blunt, and under the influence, he could provoke anyone, not with fists, but with words. He knew exactly where to push. Sober, he was tolerable. Drinking, he was emotionally volatile. Provoking people not because he wanted a conflict, but because he simply couldn't stop talking until the other person snapped. This man ended up in an apartment with another lonely drinking man, but one with a completely different temperament. Dmitry was silent. Mikhail was vocal. One kept everything inside, the other let it all out. They were brought together by the only thing they had left: a bottle. The investigation was still determining how they met, but it is known that on Saturday evening, Mikhail went to visit Dmitry on Lake Lane. He never walked out. Mikhail once had his own home. A friend who had known him for a long time said they were neighbors until late 2020, when his house caught fire due to faulty wiring. Everything burned down. After that, Mikhail was on the street. For a while, he lived at a local church out of compassion. Then he left, only to return later and live in a shed next to the ruins of his former home. It's important to understand the scale. No housing, no help, no compensation. Mikhail often complained that he was being rejected everywhere. The system saw him but did nothing. The shed wasn't a temporary fix, it was the end of the line. A man living in a shed next to his own ashes isn't solving problems anymore. He is just existing. In that state, an invitation to a warm apartment with drinks wasn't just a social offer, it was the event of the week. Of all the people who once knew Dmitry, only one remained: his brother. He lived separately but visited regularly, bringing food and checking in. He did it because no one else would. The neighbors were indifferent, and his old friends from the resort had long lost touch. The only remaining thread was the brother who kept appearing at the door with grocery bags. Earlier that year, the brother and their mother tried to change things. Dmitry was taken for treatment and was away for 10 days. Neighbors didn't know the specifics, but when he returned, he immediately began drinking again without a pause, as if those 10 days had been erased. Bottle, shop, silence. For the brother, this became the point where he stopped expecting change. Yet, he kept coming. Saturday, October 7th, evening. The brother arrived at the apartment to check in, as usual. He knocked, but Dmitry didn't open. Why is unclear. Maybe he didn't want visitors, maybe he was already intoxicated, or maybe he just didn't care. The brother waited and then left. Nothing unusual. A while later that same evening, Mikhail arrived at the same door. He came with one goal: to drink. For him, it was a normal visit. This time Dmitry opened the door. 2 knocks at the same door in one evening, silence for one, an invitation for the other. He didn't open for the brother who brought food, but he let in the acquaintance he only shared drinks with. The door closed. What happened next can only be reconstructed from evidence and statements. They sat and drank. Heavily. For a long time. Investigators believe the incident occurred during the night between Saturday and Sunday. Between the first glass and the use of the knife, something happened. They were alone in a closed apartment. No witnesses. We don't know what they discussed or who started the argument. Dmitry gave no statement. We only know that at some point, the conversation turned into a conflict. What exactly Mikhail said to Dmitry, or where he quote through with his words, was never established. There was no clear motive or subject of conflict, just two intoxicated men in a small kitchen until one of them stopped listening. Dmitry grabbed a knife, not from a drawer but whatever was nearby, and struck multiple times. Mikhail had no chance. The injuries were to vital areas, and the outcome was swift. The struggle likely lasted only a minute. Then, silence returned to the apartment. Mikhail was on the floor. Dmitry stood nearby. It was the middle of the night, and the night was just beginning. This is where the story shifts from a common tragedy to something else. Everything up to this point, a drunken quarrel ending in a fatal incident, is a pattern seen hundreds of times a year. But what Dmitry did next does not fit that pattern. He was alone in the silence of the village. No one knocked, no one knew. What happened in the following hours was pieced together by forensic experts. He took the knife and began the work his brother would discover in the morning. He separated the remains, placing some in the freezer and some in a basin. He put a pot on the stove, filled it with water, peeled and sliced potatoes, added fragments of the remains, and turned on the heat. This didn't take a minute or two. Hours passed while a lone man methodically carried out these actions. Cutting, organizing, cleaning, cooking. No panic, no attempt to flee, no call for help. No attempt to dispose of the evidence in a typical way, like burying it. Instead, just the pot with potatoes. He likely didn't sleep. He likely continued to drink. What was he thinking? We will never know. Sunday morning arrived. The brother returned with a bag of food. Around 9:30 a.m. he stood at the door. He knocked. Silence. But today he didn't leave. Perhaps it was intuition or just stubbornness. He knocked again, louder. Still nothing. No voices, no steps, no sound of a TV. The apartment felt empty, yet he knew Dmitry hadn't gone anywhere. The brother shouted through the door, quote 4, a pause. The silence behind the door changed. It became tense. Someone was there, deciding. The door opened. The brother stepped inside and immediately understood why it had been closed. Dmitry was in the kitchen. On the floor were the remains. The burner was on and the pot was bubbling. The brother had caught Dmitry in the middle of the process. Dmitry wasn't hiding. He wasn't panicking. He stood there, doing what he was doing. The brother asked what happened. Dmitry replied calmly, as if explaining something mundane. __, quote _5, __. That was it. Not a word about the pot, the freezer, or the basin. It was as if there was no connection between the initial conflict and what was currently happening on the stove. __, quote _6, __, he claimed. Even if Mikhail had started the fight, it might explain the knife, but it explains nothing of what followed. The brother didn't argue. He turned around, walked out, and called 112. Dmitry stayed inside with the door open and the pot still on the fire. Forensic experts worked for hours, documenting the scene and seizing the contents of the stove, freezer, and basin. Dmitry was taken into custody. The investigative committee opened a case for a serious felony. They ordered medical, forensic, and most importantly, psychiatric evaluations. On October 10th, a court in Vyborg ordered Dmitry to be held in pre-trial detention. The news spread within 24 hours with shocking headlines. Soup made of a friend, human broth, the cannibal of Leningrad region. By the evening of October 10th, the whole country knew about Michirinskoye. Everyone had one question: why? The key detail was the potatoes. This wasn't someone panicking to hide tracks. This was someone preparing a meal. Investigative sources suggested the suspect was preparing food from the remains for consumption. There were two terrifying possibilities. First, Dmitry intended to eat this by his own will. Pure cannibalism. Second, he did it without understanding his actions, because his mind was no longer functioning normally. Media outlets chose the first version. It was simpler and more sensational. While the headlines circulated, an external expert, psychiatrist, narcologist Vasily Shurov, offered 4 theories. First, a gruesome way to dispose of remains. Second, the idea to cook could have been a distorted logic to destroy evidence, as boiling breaks down tissue faster. Third, alcoholic brain degradation. Years of heavy drinking destroy the frontal lobes responsible for control and logic. In this version, he isn't a predator, but a man with irreversible brain damage. Fourth, a latent mental illness, such as schizophrenia, which could have suddenly flared into an acute psychosis. Each version explained the scene, but only a medical evaluation could prove the truth. One detail stood out. The theory of schizophrenia fit the facts of Dimitri's life, the sudden decline from a successful athlete to this state, uncomfortably well. In the spring of that same year, months before the incident, Dimitri had been seen by doctors. The conclusion was brief: competent. Formally, this meant he was not a threat to himself or others. No grounds for involuntary hospitalization. He spent a few days in detox, and the system let him go. 6 months later, this competent man would be standing over a pot of remains and potatoes. Looking back, no one had asked what he saw when he was alone. No one asked who he talked to in his empty apartment. Later, the brother recalled strange details. Dimitri would talk to him calmly and mention that his father was coming over for lunch. He spoke of it as a mundane fact. Dimitri's father had been dead for a long time. Then another detail. Dimitri claimed someone else lived in the apartment with him, someone small. He lived alone, but in his mind, the apartment was full of people. He was cooking, peeling potatoes, and making soup for people who didn't exist, for a dead father, for guests only he could see. The pot on the stove now takes on a different meaning. It likely wasn't cannibalism or cold-blooded disposal. It was the action of a man whose psychosis had erased the boundary between reality and hallucination. A man who, after a fatal conflict, simply continued his daily routine, preparing a meal for the visitors he expected to join him at the table. Dimitri remains in custody pending the results of his psychiatric evaluation. But one answer is already clear. The system examined a man who would soon be feeding ghosts and seeing people in empty rooms, and it wrote one word in his file: competent. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know your thoughts in the comments.